Hey everybody, welcome back to School Sucks Live. I'm Brett. With me in the studio, Bob and his little head is Osborne. And we have our two guests out in Keene in the Free Talk Live studio tonight, Derrick and Michele Seven.
Hey.
Hello.
Thank you guys so much for sticking with us for all 2 hours. And we just learned that you will both hang with us a little bit longer on the After School Sucks
Because I hear
special.
it gets to get naughty.
Oh, yeah. Well, we broadened the topics that we're willing to talk about, and that's we've had a really good time, and I think we've had some really groundbreaking content on that show. It is called the After School Sucks Special. It is not on LRN. You can only watch it at schoolsucksproject.com/live on our UStream feed. And we still take your calls. You can still participate in our little chat there. And it just opens wide up and we can talk about whatever we want. So it's a wonderful thing. Before we went to the break, Michele was talking about her motives behind civil disobedience. So Michele, I'll let you pick it up right there.
So 12 years old, sixth grade, and there was a field trip that students would take every year from the entire county, where we would take buses upriver, and it's like a 2-hour drive, which where I live, I drove maybe 2 hours away once a year. I mean, that was unheard of. You just didn't drive that far to go anywhere, you know? So for us to drive upriver on the buses where scary people lived and all the logging was done was a really big deal. And of course, you know, we got to have a sack lunch and blah, blah, blah. We missed classes, but we would go and we'd plant these 25 seedlings and learn all about the lumber industry. And that's it was the foundation to the economy in Coos Bay, Oregon, and all of Oregon actually. And it gave the lumber guys a chance to, you know, teach us about their craft. And considering, you know, like 30% or something like that of guys graduating from high school got involved in some fashion in the lumber industry. It was a really big deal. So I went at it from a principal perspective and discussed that with my teachers after being told that the unions had said no, that it was dangerous, that, you know, it was cutting in on the workers' time, and, you know, they were having to volunteer some of their hours and blah, 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 and, which they were all willing to do. And but I knew that my fellow students didn't care about it from that perspective. And so I was much smarter when I was 12 than I am at 44, I must say, because I went and called up all my fellow students in the 2 different classes and told them, hey, you're not going to get an ice cream sandwich if we don't get to go. And they were like, what? They wanted their ice cream sandwich. And, you know, they wanted their choice of chocolate milk or regular milk, which only got on field trips. And, you know, out of the 60 kids, there were only, you know, a couple that cared about the principles involved. I didn't even discuss the principles with those other people. And I called the radio station and I called the newspaper. And of course, there were lots of kids that wanted to be in the front of the newspaper. So they were willing to stand in front of the buses. And, you know, I shut the school down for the day and we ended up getting our field trip and stuff. But I've actually become more stupid as I've gotten older. And part of that has to do with pain. Because 2 years later, I was locked up for 4.5 months in a mental institution for being a manipulative subversive after going to a month and a half of school, or being enrolled for a month and a half, but only attending about 6 days because... I don't know. I didn't want to get my head shaved by the girls that were threatening to shave my head, for one thing. And also, I didn't want to be surrounded by stupid people all day long. Yeah. And I really wanted to just watch MTV and smoke pot, but and, you know, read whatever it is I wanted to read and not be bothered with, you know, whatever my time that was being wasted in high school. So I got called in and they teachers and there were 2 police officers there, and dean, and actually a political figure, and my mom and all my teachers, and they wanted to know how I could possibly have all A's and 1 C, the C being in physical education, when I hadn't attended class. And I looked at them like, well, what are you, stupid? I don't have an A in PE because I'm not attending, and you have to, part of your grade is attendance. They didn't like that at all. And they're like, no, we want to know why you have all the A's. So, well, because I've done all the work, you know? And so they didn't like that because they weren't being paid since my butt wasn't in my seat. And so I was called a manipulative subversive, and I was locked up in a mental institution for 4.5 months. And
at how old?
I was 14.
Okay.
Yeah. And most of that time I was in solitary confinement, level 0, meaning I had to eat all my meals alone and what have you. So, which meant I had to educate myself. So I got locked up and was able to do the very thing that I wanted to do anyway, which was be left alone. Because all I wanted to do was be left alone at that time in my life. So from a very young age, you know, younger than most people are ever even thinking about these sorts of things, I had already felt the heavy hand of the state.
Yeah.
I'd had my boyfriends had been locked up. By that time, I already had a few friends that were institutionalized, meaning that they were going to, you know, they've now over the course of 30 years gone from a boys' ranch to, you know, foster care to detention homes to jail to prison and what have you. And these were all kids. We were all in gifted programs together. We were all really smart, really healthy, physical athletes, what have you. And, you know, the state intervened and tried to ruin our lives. So my civil disobedience comes from the fundamental idea that I've known all my life, that I'm free. And, you know, I tell people that because I happen to be a Christian, so I tend to, a lot of my activism is kind of geared, or has been geared before I moved to Keene, toward Christians and sharing liberty with them, because I feel like they're so entrenched in the opposite of liberty.
So, Michele, you had a lot of these awful experiences while in school, and you yourself are an educator. You homeschool your kids, and you're a student of philosophy also. So I wonder if your civil disobedience is somewhat about educating others about the philosophy of self-ownership and the non-aggression principle. Because I don't
Absolutely.
know about... Okay, good. Because I wasn't sure, but for me, when I discovered these philosophies, I became obsessed with how relevant they are. And I wanted to share the gospel, so to speak, with others. And in my opinion, the best way to educate others is to live your principles. And that's the reason I got involved with Civ Dis. It's because so many of my friends and loved ones, tell me if this has been your experience as well, but they believe that the government is voluntary and has the consent of the governed. And I had to show them that that's not true. I don't think
people are thinking that anymore, though, is a thing. And so what happens when you have a void that opens up because you've like cleared something out of your mind because you've realized that it's wrong? Well, that void, you know, something needs to fill it. And so I want to be right there with what I consider to be the correct answers, which are universal moral principles. And there are really only a handful of them, you know, and whether you call it the golden rule, which I happen to not think that do unto others as you would have them do unto you is really a best thing. Because I mean, what if I like to be beaten? I don't think that therefore I should beat other people. So you've got to be careful. Your universal, it's only moral if it can be universally applied, which is why the non-aggression principle tends to be something that a lot of us kind of, you know, gravitate toward, because the idea of not initiating force is, I think, universally applicable. So yeah. Right. So I started
people could live even freer than a civil disobedient if they did so in a closed environment. If they weren't open about it, they could, you know, they could trade with others and do agorism, for example. But I don't know if, like, what makes the difference for you, Michele? Why would you do things openly rather than secretively?
Good question.
Because I don't hurt anybody, and I've never really called myself a civil disobedience activist until moving here, simply because people like to put labels. So I never called myself an anarchist. I never called myself a voluntarist. Those are all pretty recent labels to kind of put me in a group, I guess. But I believe, whether it's because you have a neocortex as opposed to just a limbic system, and are therefore not just an animal, that the only way that you can exercise your humanity is by being able to opt out and say no. And if you can't say no, and if you can't agree to things or disagree from things, then you're not free, and so you're not human.
Guys, thank you so much for participating in this conversation tonight. The documentary, Derrick J's Victimless Crime Spree on YouTube. The website is victimless-crime-spree.com. These two are going to stick with us just a little bit longer at schoolsucksproject.com/live. So join us there. Let's say in 7 to 10 minutes, we will be back and we will continue this discussion. Guys, thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. We'll talk to you in a few.